Hello again. I want to welcome everybody to our second lecture of Module 3, continuing on with our study of the branches of government, and today we will be getting into Article 2 of the Constitution, which of course describes the presidency and the executive branch. So our first objective 1, is to explain how the president can implement a policy agenda. Start by talking about presidential powers. Presidents, of course, use their powers and perform the different functions of their office to accomplish and set forth a particular policy agenda. So we're going to go through the next few slides some of their formal and informal powers that help them to craft a particular policy agenda and to promote that. First and foremost, we know one of the powers of the president is the ability to veto legislation coming from Congress. He also has the power to do something that has the same effect when he receives a bill from Congress but does not act on it within 10 days of receiving it, during which Congress remains in session. It's called a pocket veto. Has the same effect of rejecting that bill. But the veto is a formal power that enables the president to, of course, check the power of Congress, one of the main checks and balances that people talk about. Foreign policy, lots of foreign policy powers of the presidency, both formal powers and informal powers. Of course, one of his main formal foreign policy powers is to act as the commander-in-chief of the military and also to be in charge of negotiating treaties with foreign countries. Informal powers include the ability to negotiate and implement executive agreements, which essentially have the same power as treaties, but can be changed by the next president, so they have some of the same limitations that an executive order would. So all these powers help to influence relations between the United States and foreign countries. I added a note that the framers of the Constitution intend the president to be the country's main organ of foreign policy. So they wanted the president to be chief in charge of foreign policy for the United States. And they vested considerable powers, some of which we've just mentioned, in the office related to foreign policy. Some of the other things that are not mentioned here but also have to do with foreign policy powers: he has the ability to nominate our ambassadors that represent us abroad, to extend or terminate diplomatic relations with other countries. But keep in mind, some of these powers, such as treaty power and nominating ambassadors, things like that, are checked to some degree by the Senate. Continuing on with more formal and informal powers of the president, presidents have the informal power of bargaining and persuasion, and this enables the president to help to twist the arm of Congress and get them to support him on different things. And I added a note having to do with that particularly in modern times, presidents have tremendous power to set and guide the policy agenda that is taking place in Congress, in particular due to presidents' unique ability to command media attention. But there is a limitation on that, in that a president's power of persuasion and power to bargain with Congress is often related very strongly to his or her own approval among the public. So if you have a very popular president, of course, they're going to have more power to persuade Congress. If you have an unpopular president, they're going to have somewhat less ability to influence Congress. Executive orders, we mentioned them in passing on the previous slide, but executive orders are an implied power that is an extension of the president's executive power, either his executive power or sometimes from power that is delegated from Congress. They're used by the president to manage the federal government, in particular, generally to manage the bureaucracy. And then finally, signing statements are something that presidents can do. It's another informal power. When the president signs a bill into law that he receives from Congress, he can add an additional statement simply laying out, here is how I interpret this law. This is what I think it means and how it will be implemented, and that sort of thing has some degree of power and influence associated with it. I added an additional note that many presidential powers have derived from his power in terms of control over the bureaucracy. Of course, the bureaucracy is part of the executive branch, part of the government that actually enacts policies, but also to some degree Some of the president's powers also are derived from things that Congress over the years has willingly yielded to the president. So just a couple examples of this. Congress has largely yielded its power to negotiate tariffs and that sort of thing to the president over the years. And so presidents have tremendous unilateral power now to negotiate tariffs. We've seen examples of this, of President Trump enacting tariffs without any sort of input from Congress. If you read the Constitution, it says that anything as far as raising revenue and enacting tariffs and taxes and things are supposed to be the power of the Congress. But Congress has passed various laws that give extensive power to negotiate those sorts of things unilaterally to the president. Also, presidents have largely taken over the power to wage war almost entirely from Congress. Congress, of course, has the power to declare war under the Constitution, but Congress has not exercised that power to declare war since World War II. And yet we've been involved in numerous conflicts over the years. Korean War and Vietnam and the Gulf War and all sorts of different conflicts we've been involved in. So Congress has largely willingly given up really any role they have as far as declaring war to the president. Objective 2, explain how the president's agenda can create tension and frequent confrontations with Congress. We know anyone who has watched the news over a prolonged period of time knows that the president and Congress often do not get along. So conflicts with Congress, the potential for conflict with the Senate, so we're focusing on the Senate mostly on this slide, depends largely on the type of executive branch appointments he is making. Presidents, of course, appoint cabinet secretaries and other high-ranking officials. They appoint ambassadors. They also appoint members of their own staff. Now, the first two on that list, cabinet members and ambassadors, do require Senate approval. So that could create some conflict if there are problems with the people that the president is appointing as far as getting agreement with the Senate. The staff, however, White House staff does not require confirmation, so presidents have wide leeway to appoint whoever they would like to work for them in terms of personal advisors without creating any kind of conflict with the Senate. Senate confirmation is, of course, a very important check on appointment power of the president. It's one of our checks and balances. One of the presidential appointments that we didn't list above, but is very important, in fact, many people regard it as the president's most long-lasting influence, is judicial appointments. These also require Senate approval, but because these are going to be people that are serving for life, so a president could appoint a judge or a Supreme Court justice that is on the court for 30, 40, 50 years after the term of that president is over. It's going to be a very long-lasting impact. Policy initiatives and executive orders promoted by a president often lead to conflict with the congressional agenda. Presidents may do things through executive order to kind of do an end around Congress when they're not cooperating with him, and that can create additional conflicts with Congress. So President Trump, just for example, has passed a number of executive orders having to do with immigration, in part because Congress has not passed the sorts of immigration and naturalization laws that he might like. And so he has taken what unilateral authority he has over that sort of thing through executive orders, and that has sometimes created some tension with Congress. Objective 3, explain how presidents have interpreted and justified their use of formal and informal powers. There's been an evolving understanding of the presidency, evolving powers, just like the other branches of government over history. Going back to another one of our foundational documents, Federalist Essay number 70. In Federalist Essay number 70, the author talks about justifying the existence of a single executive power in the government in the form of a single president. He said that the reason for this is that a single executive, a single president, has more energy and needs to be able to act decisively. A lot of times, if you have a group of people, like a council, making decisions on things, it takes time, they can't agree. Sometimes you need a single person to make a quick decision on something, and that's one of the main reasons why they chose a single executive for the United States in the Constitution. Term of office and constitutional power restrictions, including passage of the 22nd Amendment, which of course limits presidents to 2 elected terms, demonstrate changing presidential roles. There have been some things that have restricted powers of the president, 22nd Amendment being an example of that. Different perspectives on the presidential role, ranging from a limited to a more expansive interpretation and use of power, continue to be debated in the context of contemporary events. So even today, you're going to find some people that think presidents are too powerful. When President Trump does something controversial, for example, you're going to find people that say he is exceeding his role in the office and should be limited and reined in. You're going to find other people who think their presidents are well within their roles when they do things and interpret their powers relatively expansively. Final note on this topic, I said that overall the trend has been for the accumulation of greater power and influence in the presidency since the time that the Constitution was ratified. There are a couple of exceptions to that, like the 22nd Amendment and something like the War Powers Act, which is designed to put some constraints on what presidents can do unilaterally as far as committing troops into combat. But overall, the dominant trend has been for the executive branch to become more and more powerful over the years. Objective 4, explain how communication technology has changed the president's relationship with the national constituency and other branches. So, the president has something called the bully pulpit. This is one of the president's greatest assets. And so the communication impact of the president and the presidency can be demonstrated in a lot of different ways. Modern technology in particular has greatly enhanced the president's ability to communicate his message with the public and to put pressure on other policymakers in Congress to cooperate. We see a lot of that with President Trump, both on television. He's on television a lot. During this COVID pandemic, he's had press conferences just about every single day for at least an hour, sometimes 2 hours, that command a lot of attention. Social media, of course. President Trump is a great example of the use of social media. He's very active on getting his message out on Twitter, rapid response to political issues. The fact of the matter is that the president is empowered in a way that no other person in the United States is, as far as policymakers, to promote his agenda. Because he is a single person compared to 435 members of Congress, 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, so 535 members of Congress. It's hard to listen to all of them, but it's easy to listen to a single president. Another example of this, the command of communication, is every single year the president gives a very famous speech called the State of the Union Address, in which he has many of the eyes of the American public watching this very well-known speech that he gives before a joint session of Congress, where he can promote his policy agenda and help to set the agenda for the country, which is one of the most powerful tools of the president.